Hello and welcome to Wisdom Talks, the podcast accompanying the Metis project, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices, to be found on www.metis.ethz.ch. I am delighted to say that Willi Goetschel will join us for the fourth time on our podcast again. Willi Goetschel is Professor of Philosophy and German Studies at the University of Toronto. Goetschel has talked to us about Heine, Spinoza, and Goethe previously. Today he will turn his attention to an author we have often mentioned in various wisdom talks, Michel de Montaigne. Joining Goetschel is Michael Hampe, Professor of Philosophy at ETH Zurich and initiator of the Metis project. Michael Hampe, an avid reader of Montaigne, will introduce the 16th century French philosopher and his work himself. So all that is left for me to say is, happy listening.
Thank you, Ilian Schmidt, for this kind introduction, and I welcome Willi Goetschel, who will talk with us about Montaigne today. Michel de Montaigne, who lived from 1533 to 1592, was born and died on the castle of Montaigne. So he was a French nobleman, but also a magistrate, a parliamentary councillor, a diplomat, and last but not least, mayor of Bordeaux. It is said that in his writing he made himself the first and foremost topic. He said, "I am myself the content of my book." He did not invent this type of autobiographical philosophy, since it existed already at least since the Confessions of Augustine from the year 397 AD. But he invented a philosophical form in order to do his autobiographical philosophy, the essay. In these essays, he tries to look at himself from many different perspectives and with the help of the philosophical tradition. Montaigne is also a kind of predecessor of Descartes, whose famous Meditations appeared in 1641, and for quite a while Descartes was, with his attempt to erect a new system of philosophy on absolute firm ground, the cogito argument, much more influential in European philosophy than Montaigne, who was a skeptic, perhaps a multiperspektivist author, who did never try to hide his doubts and his weaknesses. It has been said that the uncertainty of existence was always present in his mind, not at least because of the early death of his close friend Etienne de la Boétie, that reminded him of his own end. His most famous saying is perhaps that to philosophize means to learn to die. Just as he knew about the finitude of life, in the same way he was aware about the fragility of all doctrines and opinions. This supposedly led him to a wise modesty, a special type of skepticism and eclecticism. Nowadays, his apology of Raymond Sebon is often read again, where he demeans the intelligence of man by questioning his preeminence over the animals. Perhaps Montaigne was the first philosopher arguing for animal rights. Montaigne is always criticizing human pride. The happiness he tries to reach is focusing on everyday life. He said of himself, "When I dance, when I sleep, I sleep." But before we come to the content of his wisdom, let's talk about the new form he supposedly invented. What, Willi Goetschel, is an essay, and how does the essay relate to other forms of writing in philosophy like aphorism, dialogue, or the monographic system?
First of all, the title of the essays is important. So he uses the essays as a collective title, but what we call an essay today is actually a chapter. And so the essay means simply in English, it comes from the essaying, like essaying gold or so, like an attempt, a trial, a test. And so they are trying to work out questions, but in a very different way than classic philosophical genres.
So it's not a collection of essays, but the whole 3 books are one essay. How do chapters and essays relate to each other?
So the whole thing are essays, he calls the individual, what we call an essay, he calls a chapter. And the important point is that we understand a modern essay as a freestanding text that you can publish and read by itself, whereas some of the beauty and complexity of the chapters or the book as a whole is that they are interrelated. They talk to each other, they pick up topics, drop it, pick it up again. So it's a grown thing with moving parts, actually. So that is what it is. And initially, he was developing it. He was initially starting with what in the time of the humanists of the Renaissance did, like a florilegium, like a collection of texts, of quotes. And so he then started with that, and we see the essays, they're shot through with different texts from different languages, and in the original they're quoted in Greek, in Latin, sometimes in French, like wherever he takes the text from. And that's important too. They're not just classic texts, it's all over the place.
So you're saying he's developing a form that was in part already existing. The collection of quotes was already existing in Renaissance literature, and he is developing that further.
Right. And so he's developing out of this existing thing, like he wasn't planning it in a way. We don't know. He hasn't written about what he was planning or what he was doing. And so the essays grew into their own thing eventually. And so in that way, they are the first, like with this book or this first 2 volumes, and then at the end it was 3 volumes of the essays, he founded or established this new genre that we know. But it's important to know that his essays wouldn't qualify in the way we understand essay today, which is also supposed to often be short. His essays the collective thing is 1,000 pages at least, depending on what edition you take. And in that way, it's a form, but the form is more decided by the writing mode. It's not like formal external markers of length or voice, but it's the way it's, and it's not just his voice. That's another strange thing. That's why I mentioned the other quotes. So this is a tapestry or a literary weave of different voices, of different texts. And at the same time, there's this phenomenon that now Montaigne's own voice emerges with it. But it's a very distinct voice, but that at the same time is interconnected with all these other voices. And so that's what his kind of writing means. And so it's voices, it's quotations, it's languages also. So I mentioned already Greek, Latin, then sometimes he quotes even in Gascogne in of his regional language. And he quotes whatever language he can take. And also in terms of time, he goes back to antiquity, but he also quotes his neighbor. He quotes anything, any voices. They're all like one big salad bowl, if you want.
And how do you look at this plurality of voices? There is a picture of Descartes, I think it's by Holbein, I don't remember it for sure, where he sits on his desk and his feet are resting on a pile of books. And if you look at what books he has under his desk in order to support his feet, it's the works of Aristotle. That's what Aristotle is good for. You can put your feet on it. And Descartes doesn't quote anybody. He's just thinking for himself. So what does it mean that Montaigne is quoting so many people from the tradition and from his surrounding? To my mind, there are 2 possible interpretations. You could say that he is displaying his learnedness, quoting Cicero and Seneca, and then putting his own voice into this quotation could mean I am part of this tradition that I know. But when you say he's quoting also his neighbors, who nobody might know and who are not part of the canon, it could be a very humble attitude by saying, well, we're all in the same boat, my neighbor, Seneca, me. So how do you evaluate this eclecticism, as it is sometimes called?
Right, yeah. I think there's a passage even where Montaigne mentions that literally, that he talks about his pleasure of diversity. So he does thrive on diversity of multiple voices. And I think one of the aspects why he likes it is to show that there's a continuum of maybe also the way he thinks about tradition. There's all these voices, and now there's his voice, and they all stand in their own right. And there's not a right and wrong. Each has in some ways a right, what they say in their particular context. And so he's also distinctively not a philosopher or not a learned person. He studied at the university, but as a legal scholar. So he doesn't see himself as an academic, but he represents historically also the new gentleman, the new general reader. And he's the first one in that way. So his book also, which is also very important, it's dedicated, traditionally books are dedicated to a prince or another highly located sponsor to protect it. Now he dedicates it to simply his friends and his family. And he said, this book is for nobody else. Like, if you're not interested in me, don't read it. It's just like my story. Who cares? And so in that way, he deflates already the entire scholarly approach. And with it, the idea, right, that I just give my little humble voice to it. And of course, this little humble voice often corrects, but it corrects just in making it more diverse, more open. He's less interested in like right and wrong, but more in like how differences and contradictions exist. Like he has, I think it's the first essay even has this beautiful title, like how you can end with completely opposite ends with the same proposition. And he pulls it through. He says, the thing is, so you may be brave or coward in like you're accosted by maybe some enemies, like with people brandishing arms. Are you brave or are you now submissive? And he gives example for both, like you can be killed in both cases, saying like there's not a wisdom literally to be always like that, or it depends. Mm-hmm. You can do this, you can do that. So he's more interested in showing as a rich range of opinions and views. That's what his thing is really.
So is he then dropping the agonistic view of philosophy? You could describe the history of European philosophy as a sort of battle that Plato tries to show that Parmenides and Heraclitus are wrong, that you need a theory of ideas, and Aristotle seems to criticize Plato that there cannot be a heavens of ideas, and Descartes, as I just mentioned, thinks that Aristotle is totally obsolete and that you have to reboot philosophy, so to say. So there's a battle of systems, so to say, going on. And what you just described seems to mean that Montaigne doesn't want to participate in this battle. Is that right?
Right, yeah. He also institutionally does not participate. He is this gentleman who is retired on his castle. He just writes for himself and his family, his friends. And so for him, like the academic competition is not relevant, like he's not even part of it. But also his argument of thinking is almost, reminds me of Theodor W. Adorno, who has at some point in the Minima Moralia this passage where he says, you know, true philosophy is not winning the argument, but actually the art of losing it, of giving what Benjamin would call the weak force. And Montaigne has many passages to that effect too. Let's do the weak argument. Let's not bring up the powerful tools, but let's look how things in life actually develop. And maybe we can see things and our cognitive apparatus won't distort the situation if we just like play soft. I think that is a very crucial difference that he develops with his book.
And you said at the beginning that the chapters are not meant to stand alone, that you should read them all and that they relate to each other. One might say they mirror each other sometimes. Does that mean that it has some similarity, his method of thinking, with aphorisms? Because later on, aphorisms, for example, by Wittgenstein, perhaps also by Adorno's Minima Moralia you just mentioned, are sometimes described as talking to each other, mirroring each other as well. Is the essayistic style a kind of aphoristic style too, or are they different from each other?
Yeah, I think this is a difficult question in terms of there's aphoristic moments in Montaigne when he says something that you feel like that's just a statement. But then often it's buffered by another statement that sort of like softened it again. And so the difference is maybe, it would be aphorism maybe in, I'm not sure whether Wittgenstein would qualify, but more in the Nietzschean way of longer paragraphs where you like thought movements. So for Montaigne, everything is process. Everything is like evaluating, thinking, trying it out. And, if it works, it works. If not, it doesn't. And in the context or in the course of this, we have, of course, moments that pop up in distinction. But it's very hard. I found also when I work with Montaigne, I felt like I need always to quote at least a paragraph or like a few lines, because otherwise it would get abbreviated to like a sound bus. And that sometimes there is moments where you can do it, but overall it's always almost melodious. It's going back and forth. And the reason of this quoting business is also that there's always a stream in which ideas emerge and they're addressed to other. There's not isolated thought. It's everything is a dialogue. It's an ongoing conversation for him. And he has even a chapter which is called On the Art of Conversation, which is actually not where he says necessarily most of it, but I think he has one section which is, I think, towards the end in his last essay, if I'm correct, where he talks about what is a real like conversation, how does that work, or what is real philosophy, real thinking. And he uses the very modern concept of tennis. Of course, it's called the jeu de paume, the play with apples, because they did use apples in those times, and they could be deadly. His brother was killed by one actually, because if they hit them. But he said, so the beauty of this tennis thing is that the thought or the conversation is not in one corner or in one part of the court. It's this back and forth. And that's what is the movement of thought.
So you think that if readers cut out sayings like to philosophize means to learn to die, or live in the moment, when I dance, when I sleep, they are reducing the essays to two short aphorisms.
Right, yeah, especially with to philosophize is to learn to die, which is the title of a chapter. I'm not sure whether that's the full title or whether it's like mediated a bit, but the essay itself, so the problem is the title is just the announcement, more complicated and there's a debate about it also with Montaigne, that the title often don't tell you what is really happening in the chapter. So often you can't read, like if you look for a particular topic, sometimes it says a few verses by Virgil. You have no clue that it's going to be about love. But love is in half of the essays. There's something on love happening. And so, yeah, the question is, so he says, yeah, does philosophy mean the art of dying? And that could be also sort of a very funny comment by him, by the fact that he didn't think very highly of philosophy. So philosophy, that's what it's good for, you learn how to die. He was very life-affirming, actually, and the essay itself doesn't give you a clue in what direction it goes, but one could also argue, and it has been argued, that this is actually very critical by him, that precisely philosophy is very much about the art of living, very close, like what Spinoza also says at some point, that the wise man thinks about life, not about death. But death does play an interesting role in Montaigne, and the essays wouldn't have been written in a way maybe without the death, and that's the death of his best friend, Etienne de la Boétie, who basically, and that's the story, that's maybe the first nutshell of an essay, or in that way, is his letter to his, Montaigne's letter to his father, where he describes the scene of the death of La Boétie, and it's very touching and interesting. And so La Boétie is on the deathbed because of some kind of a flu he caught at the time, very early. He's, I think, maybe a little bit over 30, very young, accomplished, just like Montaigne, a high-ranking, I think Boétie was higher-ranking in the Bordeaux Parliament, which was the legislative court of the king, a high-ranking administrative lawyer, basically. And he tells him, he implores Montaigne, when I die, give me a place. And Montaigne says, I have no clue. What the hell does he mean? And this seems to be really important. And then he goes on and starts writing his essays. And the essay that's at the center of the first volume of the essays, the first edition had 2 volumes, and the first volume really in the middle, and it's a complex panel even of maybe 10 essays, before, 5 before and after, and in the middle is then the essay on La Boétie. And further on it, he was planning to bring in the essay Le Discours de la Servitude Volontaire, the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, which was the first, is the first anarchistic treatise, which he wanted to put in. It became politically so radical, just actually during the time he wanted to publish it, that he had to take it out. He replaced it with sonnets. Then he took later the sonnets out to create an empty space, like a tomb. And in this tomb of the first volume is La Boétie. And so the first volume and the writing is initiated with this idea, how do I present the absent? How do I present in life death? But in this way of almost a literary impossibility, like a referential paradox or a pariah. How do I do this? And his whole writing throughout his essay play with the theme of voluntary servitude in very different registers. And so in that way, death is a central motive, but a way, and that makes Montaigne also so modern, while he's also looking back to antiquity as also maybe a very antique motive, actually, of Epicurean, Lucretian aspects to be very life-affirming. We also know, actually, that he was an avid reader of Lucretius on Nature, the long poem, and he was the proud owner of one of the first editions with his vast notes on it. So life, pleasure, all those things, they played a crucial role for him.
And do you think that he interpreted the question or the demand of his dying friend Etienne rightly? That did he ask for a grave, a physical grave, or did he ask for a certain type of memory, for a mental or spiritual grave? Did he know that Montaigne was writing, and do you think he was begging him to remember him in his writing?
Well, that's the question. Yeah, I guess certainly that's how Montaigne understood it eventually. He didn't know, he knew that Montaigne would write, but not as much as La Boétie had been a writer. Montaigne also wrote poetry, but he became a writer really because of La Boétie, because he wanted to make him present in this way. So I guess that is the interesting question that states what does it make for a loved one when they're left to have them in our life? And so in that way, it's a very deep, profound comment on voluntary servitude, but servitude now interpreted in a very different way than the critical way. So that La Boétie had when he felt not a voluntary submission to tyranny, but to freedom, actually. So I think that is this question of what is the place? And the idea then, and I think that became then the answer or the response by Montaigne, this is in writing, in commemorating. Or what is commemorating? Commemorating is writing. It's not a mute monument, but it's a speaking monument.
And is that, you think, the reason for the many quotes as well, that he wants to keep the memory of his neighbors, gone authors, and so on?
Yeah, I think there's something interesting about that, the way he deals with tradition. So he's often read as a conservative, Montaigne, which I don't think you can actually claim when you read him carefully. His understanding of tradition is, and he says that often, also about legal institutions, about political change, you cannot just like introduce something brand new, disconnected from the past. You always have to work with the past. And I think that's the reason why he brings in all these voices. Their voices, we don't know exactly what their reasons were, why they talked the way they talked. They talked that way, and instead of just throwing it out and reinventing all anew and maybe making the same mistakes or worse ones, we should sort of formulate with the tradition, with and against it at the same time. And so this is what how the new, the innovative cannot be innovative unless it's sort of engaging with the past.
That sounds to me as if he's in a double sense non-Cartesian. And in the first sense, as you just described it, that he is skeptical that you can get rid of the tradition, that you can reboot thinking, maybe political thinking, scientific thinking, or whatever, that it's, even if you put Aristotle under your desk, you won't get rid of him, and you might run into the same mistakes that people before you ran into, and that's perhaps a sort of wise advice for how to deal with your past. But what you said also reminds me of perhaps Jewish motive that comes up in Blumenberg, in Hans Blumenberg, the German philosopher and historian of philosophy, that you have to be fair to past voices. If you relate to them, you have to make them sound according to their own intentions, and you should not use the past just as a field for your own projections or as an instrument for your own ideas. And I think that was one of the motives for Hans Blumenberg doing history of philosophy. Montaigne is not a historian of philosophy, but as you described him, by quoting past voices in order to give them a place, seems to mean more than just looking for affirmation of your own opinion. A modern atomist, say Boyle, might quote Democritus by saying, "My theory has already been produced in important ancient times." So he quotes not only in order to have an ancient source, it seems, but in order to do justice to gone voices. Is that right?
Right, yeah. So Montaigne is much more interested in also what contradicts him, actually. And he says that at some point, that he says, when I look for inspiration or instruction, it's I don't want to read the people I know, they think like me. I actually have to go there to where the opposite is said to, and I have to sort of get accustomed to it. I have to widen my tolerance to deal with that. And he is fascinated also with the opposite. And he is very opposite to the Cartesian model of the self as a foundation. So Montaigne, like the way he describes his self, which becomes the object of his book, and he says, this is a boring book. You have to be ready. I just talk about myself. Of course, at over 1,000 pages, it becomes clear that you cannot talk about yourself unless you talk about yourself always in connection and relation to the outside, to the others. And so that is the other part of where he also responds to Lavoisier and his philosophical work in his discourse on voluntary servitude. That is the mutuality and the reciprocity, that we as humans, we are not individuals that are freestanding. We are only who we are in response, in relationship to others. And that is very, very important to him. And I think that's the other reason why he is very rich in citing. And he actually in that way shows that self that exists only because of the others. And it would be different with others. And so in that way, it's always contingent to a certain degree. And you can be different in different places and with different people. And he talks about that too. So the self for him is something that's constantly changing. So that is very modern. And it's, I think, especially important today where we already want to talk about the post-subjective ideas. And Montaigne, because he's just before Descartes and before Locke, has still resources, as Spinoza has in his own way, to think differently, to think about what Etienne Balibar calls the transindividual, following Simondon, the idea that the individual is always also a trans figure, that is like we are the relations that we are. And so in that way, the essays is just that also. And so in that way, you could say we are also only what our traditions are. And we don't even know ourselves if we don't know our traditions. And we certainly can't get out of those traditions or change them if we don't know what they are.
Perhaps I should remind our listeners about the way Descartes talks about the self, because it's very interesting that an author writing before Descartes can be read as a critic of Descartes' conception, because Descartes, with his, as he calls his methodical doubt, tries to shut himself out of the world. The world might be a dream. Everything he gets to his senses, everything he memorizes might be false, might be produced by a malengenie, by an evil spirit. But one thing is left, that he, as a doubting, thinking creature, exists. So it's the idea of an isolated substance that is able to think. And that's what is left in Descartes of the self, but it's also the substance by which he believes he could build up secure knowledge. So it's the entire opposite of what the picture you just painted of a self that comes from a tradition that is related to friends, that has lots of different perspectives and different social relations, and is what it is only because of this being bound into this network.
Right. So there's a very different sense, and it connects also with the discovery of the Americas during his time. And there's his famous essay on the cannibals, which is also actually in this 10 essay panel about La Boétie, because the way it's set up is the cannibals, he talks to them also, the so-called cannibals from Latin America, from this particular tribe. And they say pretty much, they channel basically La Boétie. It's very funny, and we don't know what they really said, but it sounds really pretty much the same. And so this idea of that they're people, they don't have property concepts, they live very different. And this idea is that also the way what we think about our egos is historically grown. And it's not that he suggests that we should cancel it completely, but it's a complex negotiation and much more also a process. And that strikes me as really being very modern today, that we understand also pretty much like today, we have a lot of knowledge, but the knowledge is all contextual. It's all limited. We only know that much, and cultures are respond to the same challenges in so different ways that there's not one way, and that's what he's fascinated. And his time when they meet first people outside of Europe and outside of the known world that have completely different lifestyles. And his answer is, well, that's not our lifestyle, but they and the way they describe us, we are pretty absurd people, like the way they, and so in that way, this relativity it doesn't mean anything goes. Like it's all written out also of a very deep ethical concern about against violence. That is one thing that he's very clear about. He has a beautiful essay about cruelty, which is with today's world in which we live with. I don't know whether that fits in here, but with just like the debate by Trump and the threat of Trump returning, where he says, all cruel people are actually cowards. Cruelty is a function of cowardness, not of strength. And it takes, of course, a strong position to play that through, because this is so not what our traditional psychology would think. And so in that way, he, like this idea of that, actually that ego or the I that we have is so fragile, and so he compares it to like a leaf, like a little bubble on top of the water. We are thrown here and there with our emotions. He talks about the fluctuation of the soul just very closely. Again, like Spinoza, they have both very different ideas, not like this firm epistemological subject that knows it all and we can just like escape ourselves into that little upstairs with us. He has also this little room where he withdraws himself, but it's not one of superiority, it's just one of privacy, to look at things more critically.
Perhaps we can have a closer look at this cruelty essay, because it seems to me that it's also important in its form. If I remember it rightly, there's a scene of a capital punishment, and there is a crowd cheering what is going on, and Montaigne himself says he cannot watch it. He is aesthetically repelled from it. And there's another scene where he describes a deer hunting and says he could not stand the sight of the eyes of the deer being hit by the arrow. And some philosophers believe that this is too weak a position against cruelty, because there is no argument going on, but just an aesthetic evaluation that he, the private Montaigne, is not able to stand the sight of cruel actions. So they believe there should be a stronger argument why you are not allowed to be cruel, say the categorical imperative by Kant, say. Are you of the same opinion that this is just an asceticist turning away from a scene of capital punishment or from a hunting scene? Or how do you describe the anti-cruel ethics of Montaigne?
I don't think it is aesthetic, and I think often, because he has a literary aspect, he is too quickly often reduced to an aesthetic side. I think it's a very deep insight. He actually also was present at some point in Bordeaux when one of the previous mayors was killed by a mob. So he was very familiar with mobs his whole life. I think his argument, which is implicit, is the brutalizing effect of cruelty. And I think it's a beautiful idea that, especially today, when we are exposed to see people killed on even TikTok or God knows what, to see, if you do that, this actually is already a brutalizing act. And when you do it, you become brutalized.
So you think he turns away from the scene because he's afraid of becoming infected by the cruelty?
Yeah, I think it's not just a self-protection, but also if you can face that, not just do it, but if you can face that, then there's something wrong with you as a person. And I think that is the implicit argument that he has.
But isn't that very unusual for his time? Because there is an ethics of the soldier, the Stoic ethics, that there are situations where you have to be able to be cruel to your enemy in a battle, say. And Montaigne is not only talking about him not being able to watch this cruelty, but he's also talking quite a lot about his own suffering, his own fears.
Right,
Or, for example, about his kidney stones, and that he tries to get a cure for his kidney stones and how painful it is. And that seems to be quite unusual for his time, where you have to be brave and where you have to be able to stand, to be able to go through pains and so on.
Right.
Is he an anti-Stoic philosopher in his ethics, or is it too plain a description?
No, I think you're right. I think you can't reduce him to the Stoa, to the Stoic ethics. He has motives of the Stoic ideas, and as he has also of Epicure. And he mixes them. In that way, he is clearly eclectic. He picks and chooses, but it coheres, I think, in an interesting way. So he was actually a soldier himself also, and he talks about it, and a commander. And he could deal with pain a lot. Like it's reported that when he's on his travel, he, despite his gallstones,
gallstone, it was not kidney.
Yeah. He still keeps traveling, and he doesn't care if he... so he can be very stoic at the same time, but I think this idea being that you're right, that he's one of the first, maybe the first philosopher who really talks about the importance of suffering. And the next one really who makes it important is Adorno in that way, who says, a decent philosopher is one that can give voice to suffering, address suffering. And I think that is part of his idea. And it's not metaphysical. I think it's very pragmatic in a way that if there's a necessary suffering, so there's also necessary suffering in the way, like if he needs to travel, he suffers, that's okay. But some kind of brutality involved in suffering, then that's problematic. And in that way, I would say it is deeply ethical. And again, like the idea of that you brought up in a different conversation about the Kierkegaard's indirect communication. Like if you say, well, this is ethical, this is not, that's a problem. That it's also not, as you know, anybody who has students or children knows that's not working. But if you show it this way, and then you plant this idea, so suffering is a problem. And you can actually say it, like as a philosopher, we are basically trained in a discourse that you don't talk about soft stuff. You talk about hard concepts. And now this guy comes up with suffering. And suffering is like you can talk about it and just like, and maybe not even talk it to death, but just like mention it and then let it sit and people can figure it out. I think that's actually a very deep idea. I mean, in the cruelty essay, the ultimate rejection is by saying, and there he plays again with the antique virtue ethics, that if you're a coward, I mean, he could also say to be a coward is a good thing. Now, he doesn't say that for particular reasons. And you could see Adorno saying, maybe making an argument or so, but he doesn't. But he says, no, this makes these people who grandstand as these powerful people really weaklings. And so it's almost like the way also Nietzsche argues when he's being ethical, like he does it about not good and bad, he does it about strong and weak, because that's for him the preferred language. And I think Montaigne is, of course, more complex, like he doesn't go into binaries. He runs away from binaries. So but he throws you a wrench into your way to make you think. And I think in that way, it would be, yes, you could say in the discipline of philosophy, a weak argument. And for Montaigne, because it's a weak argument, just strong enough to do its work.
It's very interesting that he seems to be the first European philosopher who is exposing suffering in such an explicit way. But then the question comes up how that relates to what you just said a few minutes ago about his reading of Lucretius and Epicurus, because these philosophers are often considered as defending that you should enjoy the day, that you should look for pleasures. That might be a too simple reading of them, but the Epicurean tradition is often distinguished sharply from, say, Buddhist influences, where the Buddha supposedly said the first truth is there is suffering. And if life is always suffering, what's the point in being cruel to anybody? If you have to suffer anyway, why pile up more suffering by fighting against each other? You should be kind to each other. That was very important for Schopenhauer, say. So how manages Montaigne to look at suffering and at the same time saying, enjoy your day. If you dance, dance. If you sleep, sleep. How does these two things go together?
I think he is an Epicurean and Lucretian, just like they were in embracing a sustainable form of pleasure. So pleasure for them is famously also like only something that's actually sustainable. If it's a quick pleasure and it ends bad, then that's not a good one. So I think he definitely is not fixated on suffering as such, but he doesn't want pleasure at the expense of suffering, like hunting, which of course is also a gentleman's sport. And it's interesting there too that he, as a gentleman, precisely says, that's not me, that's not what I do. But he's not a vegetarian either, or at least we are not aware of it. But he's also very careful in what he eats. He doesn't, because precisely he doesn't want to just like be a hedonist. And so I think but for him, pleasure means actually also interaction with people. One of the basic distinctions for him, which is maybe also important to contrast with Buddhism, for instance, is that he is, again, like Spinoza, a very, very strict opponent of the mind-body dichotomy. Mind and body, like he has a long passage even where mind and body, they're married together and you can't divorce them. And he goes so far that he even produces a Christian genealogy and he quotes even Augustine against Augustine by saying, look, here it shows like the two of the body is a beautiful thing. It needs to thrive, because if it can thrive, the soul cannot thrive. And the soul cannot thrive without the body, and the body needs also the soul. So he's not just like going one or the other way. So that is very, very strong for him.
And that's another anti-Cartesian aspect
Definitely,
of his thinking.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah. Perhaps we can come to his political life at the end, because he retired from his job or his service as a judge when he was 38. And the question is, why did he do that? Was the idea to serve Epicurus' rule that to live in secret is better than to live in public? What you just said is not supporting that he thinks it's important to have social relations and that we are social beings and have to enjoy social life. But he looks in a superficial way as a hermit in his castle, sitting under the beams of his roof with sayings being written on it and contemplating over his essays. And in a sense, if he was such a wise and smart person, it's a shame that he gave up his job as a judge. He could have done lots of good things to his society, to his community, if he would have stayed as a judge. So why did he do it? And do you think it was right to do it?
Well, the question would be, what would you prefer, that he was doing his time as a judge or that we have the essays? I think what he saw is, again, the place to make this place for his friend was like a promise that he had to do. And also retiring from to the castle, or to that estate. It was sort of not a real castle. It was sort of a smaller estate. What that meant is that he would still basically cultivate his surrounding, his family. He had his people who were depending on him.
Mm-hmm. So he was not a hermit.
And he even if he wanted to, he couldn't avoid it. He was then also used called by the king to do a high-ranking diplomatic services, for which he was a genius. Like he could stop wars. The way he did it was like very opposite, very, very difficult parties. But I think so in that way, like what he did as judge was sort of wrote things like there's only so much you can do in administration. You can't change it. You would be still an employee of the king. So it was just full administrative, high-ranking administrative law, but you are not an independent judge. So that was not so interesting. And then being a mayor of Bordeaux was not that much fun because there were also big tensions going on occasionally. And as I mentioned before, there was a risk of life. And he was at risk at some point anyway. And so when he retired, the life expectation, like he didn't become even that old at that point. So he did actually already full service at his age. And so I think for him, the idea was not to be a hermit, but, and the other thing that I wanted to say, so for him, the library that's the biggest company. So he has the biggest minds of the world who have ever written that he could amass. Of course, maybe he didn't have all, but all that we had in Europe at that point. And that for him was an intellectual communion that was sort of more enjoyable than his lawyer colleagues at the parliament, especially when he was missing his best colleague, which was Laboursi.
So he's redeemed from giving up public service. And I think your argument that we wouldn't have the essays if he would have stayed in public service is a very strong one. Thank you, Willi Goetschel, for giving us your thoughts on Montaigne.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
We have reached the end of today's Wisdom Talk on the life and work of Michel de Montaigne, and I would at this point like to invite our listeners to follow further Wisdom Talks, as well as to curiously plunge into the multitude of texts and further podcasts that can be found on our website, metis.ethz.ch, the internet portal for intercultural wisdom literature and wisdom practices. You can also find more information in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and goodbye. This Metis Wisdom Talk was produced by Martin Münnich and supported by ETH Zurich and the Udo Keller Stiftung Forum Humanum in Hamburg.